Whispers of spring, shadows of war. The morning mist clings to the cobblestones of Sainte-Mère-Église like a hesitant goodbye, reluctant to surrender the night to what promises to be another perfect spring day in Normandy. It is May 15th, 1940, and Henri Dubois has no idea that his world is already ending. He steps from his bakery into the pre-dawn darkness, flour still dusting his weathered hands, the familiar weight of routine settling around his shoulders like an old coat. For 37 years, Henri has begun each day at 4 in the morning, stoking the ovens that have fed this small village since his grandfather's time. The ritual never changes. The careful measurement of flour, the patient kneading of dough, the precise timing that transforms simple ingredients into the staff of life. But this morning carries something different in the air, something that makes the sparrows pause longer before their first tentative songs, something that causes old Madame Rousseau to linger at her window, watching the eastern horizon with eyes that remember another war. Henri breathes deeply, drawing in the mingled scents of his trade. Fresh bread, still warm from the ovens, the sweet earthiness of the Norman countryside awakening around him. Apple blossoms from the orchards that stretch beyond the village square, their white petals catching the first hints of dawn like scattered promises. This is the France he knows. The France his father defended at Verdun, the France that has endured for 1,000 years of springs just like this one. 300 kilometers to the east, German panzers are already streaming through the Ardennes forest. But Henri knows nothing of this yet. The radio in his kitchen speaks only of the Maginot Line holding firm, of British and French forces positioned along the Belgian border, of a war that seems as distant and manageable as last winter's snow. The newspapers speak confidently of French superiority, of the finest army in Europe standing ready behind the most sophisticated fortifications ever conceived. But wars are not won by newspapers, and the most sophisticated plans rarely survive contact with an enemy who refuses to follow the script. Henri sets his daily loaves in the window, each one golden and perfect, still radiating heat that fogs the glass. Across the square, the church bell tower catches the first rays of sunlight, its ancient stones warming to honey-colored life. The fountain in the center of the square begins its gentle murmur as the village pump activates, a sound as constant and reassuring as a heartbeat. This is the rhythm that has sustained Sainte-Mère-Église for centuries, the eternal dance between night and day, between hunger and satisfaction, between the fears that darkness brings and the hope that arrives with each sunrise. But rhythm can be shattered, and hope can be a dangerous companion when it blinds us to approaching storms. Marie Leclerc emerges from her cottage, a wicker basket balanced on her hip, heading for the morning market that sets up each Wednesday in the shadow of the church. She moves with the unhurried grace of someone whose days are measured not by clocks, but by the needs of her small farm, the chickens that require feeding, the cow that must be milked, the garden that demands constant attention as spring surrenders to early summer. Her husband Jacques left 6 weeks ago, called up with his reserve unit to join what everyone still calls the phony war. His last letter, received just yesterday, spoke of boredom and card games, of trenches that never saw action, and German positions that seemed as static and unthreatening as the Maginot Line itself. The Boches seemed content to sit in their holes, he had written in his careful script. Perhaps this will all be over by harvest time. Marie pauses at Henri's window, exchanging the ritual morning pleasantries. Comments about the weather, gentle gossip about neighbors, the small observations that bind rural communities together like invisible thread. Neither mentions the war directly, but it hovers between them like morning mist, present but not quite substantial enough to grasp. Beautiful morning, Henri observes, wrapping her usual loaf in brown paper. The apple trees are particularly lovely this year. Yes, Marie agrees, counting out her coins with practiced precision, though old Père Michel says the early blossoms worry him. Too much beauty too soon, he claims, as if nature is hurrying to show us something before. She doesn't finish the thought. Before what? Before the world changes? Before the rhythm breaks? The village of Sainte-Mère-Église sits precisely where geography and history have always intersected in Normandy. Its fields stretch toward the English Channel, separated from England by barely 100 kilometers of water that has served alternately as moat and bridge for 1,000 years. Vikings once sailed up these rivers. William the Conqueror marshaled his forces in these very meadows before crossing in the opposite direction to claim an English crown. The soil here is rich with more than nutrients. It holds the accumulated weight of human ambition, human folly, human resilience. Each spring ploughing turns up fragments of earlier times, Roman coins, medieval horseshoes, musket balls from wars whose names have faded, but whose consequences still shape the landscape. And now, in this spring of 1940, the soil is preparing to receive new seeds, though not the kind that Henri and Marie and their neighbors are planning to plant. The strategic value of this coastline has never been lost on military planners. The beaches that stretch north and south of the village offer some of the finest landing sites in all of Europe. Broad, firm sand that can support heavy equipment, sheltered approaches that provide protection from Atlantic storms, road networks that lead directly inland toward the heart of France. But in May 1940, such considerations seem academic. The war, everyone knows, will be fought along the German border, a replay of 1914 with better equipment and more sophisticated tactics. The Atlantic Wall exists only in the imagination of a few German staff officers, and the codename Operation Overlord will not be spoken for another 3 years. By 7 o'clock, the village square has filled with its usual morning energy. Children walk to school, their voices bright with the particular excitement that warm weather brings after a long winter. Farmers lead their cattle toward pastures where the grass grows thick and green. The postman begins his rounds, carrying letters that still speak of normal concerns. Business transactions, family news, the thousand small details that comprise ordinary life. But ordinary life, Henri is beginning to realize, may be more fragile than he ever imagined. The radio in the cafe across the square crackles to life, broadcasting the morning news from Paris. The announcer's voice carries its usual confidence, but Henri notices something new beneath the familiar phrases. A subtle tension, like a violin string wound slightly too tight. German forces continue their advance through Belgium, the voice reports. French and British units are moving to meet this expected offensive. General Gamelin expresses complete confidence in the Allied response. Expected offensive. The phrase catches in Henri's mind like a splinter. When did the war become about meeting German advances rather than launching French ones? When did confidence require such emphatic assertion? The morning progresses with deceptive normalcy. Henri serves his regular customers, each interaction a small ritual of continuity. Madame Bertrand selects her daily baguette with the same critical attention she has applied for 15 years. Young Philippe Moreau stops by before school, spending his carefully saved centimes on a sweet roll, his face bright with the simple pleasure of anticipated taste. But beneath the routine, something is shifting. Conversations pause when strangers pass. Eyes turn more frequently toward the eastern horizon. The radio in the cafe draws clusters of listeners who disperse quickly when the news ends, as if afraid to discuss what they have heard. Marie returns from the market with her basket only half full. Strange, she mentions to Henri. Several vendors didn't come today. Monsieur Gaveau said something about his son's unit being moved suddenly. Didn't say where. Henri nods, but says nothing. What is there to say? That the world they have known is balanced on the edge of a knife. That forces beyond their comprehension are already in motion. That by tomorrow, or next week, or next month, nothing will ever be the same again. The apple blossoms continue their gentle fall, carpeting the ground with white petals that will soon brown and disappear. But for now, in this moment, they remain beautiful, a reminder that even in times of uncertainty, the earth continues its ancient rhythms. The sun climbs higher, burning away the last of the morning mist, revealing a landscape of almost painful perfection. Green fields stretch toward the horizon, punctuated by farmhouses whose red tile roofs gleam like jewels. The Norman countryside spreads before them in all its timeless glory, a testament to human patience, human craft, human hope. Soon, very soon, this peaceful scene will be shattered by forces that Henri and Marie and their neighbors cannot yet imagine. But for now, in these last precious moments of the world they have always known, the bread is warm, the sun is bright, and spring continues its eternal promise of renewal. Even when that promise carries within it the seeds of unimaginable change. Add the unseen enemy. The change begins not with thunder, but with whispers. On the morning of May 16th, as Henri kneads his second batch of dough, old Claude Moreau shuffles into the bakery earlier than usual. His weathered hands shake slightly as he places his coins on the wooden counter, and there's something in his eyes. Something Henri has never seen before in all their years of morning exchanges. "The Belgians," Claude says quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "My nephew drove through Charleville yesterday. Says the roads are thick with them. Families, walking south with everything they can carry." Henri's hands pause in their rhythmic work. Charleville is only 200 kilometers north, close enough that on clear days, some say you can see the smoke from its factories. "Walking?" Henri asks, though something deep in his chest already knows the answer. "Their cars, abandoned, no petrol. The Germans." Claude's voice trails away like smoke. He takes his bread without another word, but his footsteps on the cobblestones outside sound different somehow. Heavier, as if the very ground beneath Sainte-Mère-Église has shifted overnight. By midday, the whispers have become murmurs, and the murmurs carry on the warm spring breeze like pollen, settling everywhere, impossible to brush away. Marie hears them first in the market square, where Madame Rousseau clutches her grandson's hand too tightly while speaking in hushed tones with the postmaster's wife. The words drift across the stalls of early vegetables and spring flowers. Sedan, breakthrough, tanks, so many tanks. The strategic mind understands what these fragments mean. Sedan sits at the northern terminus of the Maginot Line, where France's greatest defensive works end and the supposedly impassable Ardennes forest begins. If German armor has punched through there, if Guderian's panzers have achieved what French military doctrine deemed impossible, but Marie is not thinking of strategic implications. She is watching Madame Rousseau's face, seeing how the older woman's eyes dart constantly toward the northern horizon, as if expecting to see something terrible appear at any moment. The afternoon brings the first refugees. They appear like ghosts materializing from heat shimmer on the main road from Reims. A family. Father, mother, two small children, pushing a wooden cart loaded with belongings that seem pitifully few for an entire life. The man's suit, once fine, is wrinkled and stained with dust and sweat. The woman carries the smaller child, a girl perhaps 3 years old, who stares with enormous dark eyes at everything and nothing. They stop at the village fountain to drink and rest. And gradually, carefully, the people of Sainte-Mère-Église emerge from their shops and homes. Not crowding, not overwhelming these strangers with questions, but simply present, available. The way rural people have always been when travelers arrive in need. Henri brings bread. Marie offers milk for the children. Others contribute what they can. A bit of cheese, some early strawberries, a clean cloth to wipe small faces. And slowly, in fragments, the story emerges. The man's name is Philippe Durand. He managed a small factory in Charleville-Mézières, manufacturing parts for agricultural equipment. 3 days ago, he tells them, the first German aircraft appeared. Not the slow, lumbering bombers they had expected, but something else entirely. "Stukas," he says, and the word falls among them like a stone dropped in still water. They came down like hawks, screaming. You cannot imagine the sound, like the air itself was being torn apart. His wife, Céleste, holds their infant son closer as Philippe speaks. Her eyes remain fixed on the southern horizon, as if already calculating how much farther they must go to find safety. "The tanks came after," Philippe continues, his voice steady but hollow, not slowly, not carefully, like a flood. Grey and black, moving faster than anything that heavy should move. And the sound. He pauses, searching for words, like thunder that never stops. The children of Sainte-Mère-Église listen from behind their parents' legs, absorbing these impossible images. Tanks that move like water, planes that scream like demons. A world where factories and homes and everything solid can simply disappear. But it is what Philippe doesn't say that carries the deepest chill. He doesn't mention French resistance, doesn't speak of counterattacks or defensive lines holding firm, doesn't offer reassurance that this grey tide will soon be stopped, pushed back, contained. Instead, when young Father Leblanc asks gently about French forces in the area, Philippe simply shakes his head. A small gesture, but it contains multitudes of meaning that the strategic mind immediately recognizes. The speed of the German advance, the collapse of coordinated defense, the terrible efficiency of blitzkrieg doctrine made manifest. As evening approaches, more refugees appear on the roads. Not many. Sainte-Mère-Église sits away from the main arteries of flight. But enough to transform the village's understanding of its place in the world. An elderly couple from Rethel, walking because their son's car broke down 50 kilometers back. A young mother with twin boys, her husband already mobilized somewhere, she knows not where. A priest from a village whose name no one recognizes, carrying nothing but a small satchel and a wooden crucifix worn smooth by decades of handling. Each brings fragments of the same impossible story. German forces moving with mechanical precision and terrifying speed. French units scattered, communications severed, command structures dissolving like sugar in rain. The careful plans and defensive preparations of decades rendered meaningless in mere hours. But perhaps most unsettling of all is what these refugees represent to the people of Sainte-Mère-Église. These are not foreign strangers fleeing distant catastrophes. These are French families from French villages not so different from their own. People who 3 days ago were living lives of comfortable routine, baking bread, tending gardens, sending children to school, planning for summer harvests. People exactly like themselves. Marie finds herself studying Celeste Durand's hands as the young mother feeds her infant. Soft hands, well cared for. Hands that have never known true hardship. Hands that now shake slightly with exhaustion and fear. Marie looks at her own hands, still bearing traces of flour from the morning's work, still smelling faintly of the herbs she gathered from her garden. How quickly, she wonders, might such hands learn to shake? As night falls, the village makes space for its unexpected guests. The Durands will sleep in the church rectory. The elderly couple finds shelter with the blacksmith and his wife. Others are absorbed into homes with the quiet efficiency of people who understand that hospitality is not mere courtesy, but sacred duty. Yet even as they offer comfort, the villagers cannot escape a growing awareness of their own vulnerability. If Charleville-Mézières could fall in a single day, if the great fortress of Sedan could be bypassed as if it were made of sand, what protection could their small village possibly offer against such forces? The strategic implications are clear to anyone willing to see them. France's entire defensive strategy has been predicated on channeling German attacks into prepared killing grounds, using the Maginot Line and natural barriers to control the tempo and location of battle. But Blitzkrieg recognizes no such limitations. It flows like water around obstacles, seeking the path of least resistance, then exploiting every weakness with mechanical ruthlessness. And in this new reality, places like Sainte-Mère-Église, peaceful, undefended, strategically insignificant, are not sanctuaries, they are simply in the way. Now, Dunkirk's embrace. The roads west become rivers of humanity. Not the gentle streams that once wound through Norman countryside, but torrents of desperation. Soldiers without units, families clutching suitcases, farmers driving livestock before advancing armies. Henri finds himself swept along with thousands of others, his baker's apron traded for whatever clothes he could gather, Marie somewhere behind him in the endless column of refugees. The Luftwaffe owns the skies now. Their Stukas dive like mechanical vultures, sirens screaming, sending columns scattering into ditches and fields. Then silence, broken only by crying children and the distant rumble of engines. Always engines. German engines, growing closer. By the time Henri reaches the coast, the word has spread through the refugee columns like wildfire. Dunkirk. The British are at Dunkirk. Ships are coming. The beaches stretch endlessly under grey May skies, but they are not empty. 40,000 men wait in long, patient lines that extend from the dunes into the surf itself. British Expeditionary Force, French First Army, Belgians, all the shattered remnants of armies that were supposed to hold the line, now standing in orderly queues as if waiting for buses that may never come. The discipline is remarkable. Even in defeat, even facing capture or death, they maintain formation. Officers move among the ranks, keeping order, distributing what little food remains. Sergeants bark commands that sound almost normal, almost peacetime. If you ignore the distant thunder of artillery, the smoke columns rising from Dunkirk's burning oil storage tanks. Henri joins a line of French soldiers near the eastern mole. The man beside him, a corporal from the 9th Infantry, shares his last cigarette. "The boats," the corporal says, pointing toward the horizon. "Look at the boats." And there they are. Not just Royal Navy destroyers, though those magnificent grey shapes certainly command attention as they maneuver close to shore. But smaller vessels too. Fishing boats from English coastal towns, pleasure craft that normally carry weekend sailors, even lifeboats pressed into service. An armada of the ordinary, the everyday, the utterly civilian, all steaming toward this beach where 3 armies wait for salvation. The first Stuka attack comes at dawn. The scream of diving aircraft sends 40,000 men flat against the sand, pressing themselves into the earth as bombs bracket the beach. Sand fountains skyward, the concussions roll through your chest, through your bones. When the planes pass, the lines reform. Medics move among the wounded. The queues continue. A Royal Navy commander with a megaphone coordinates the evacuation from the mole. His voice carries across the water, crisp and professional. "Next group, move forward. Maintain spacing. Watch the tide." As if this were a training exercise rather than the largest evacuation in military history. As if 40,000 lives didn't hang in the balance of wind and weather and German artillery range. Henri watches a small fishing boat approach through the surf. The Kentish maid, her name painted in fading blue letters. She normally carries day trippers along the Dover coast, but today her skipper, a man who looks like someone's grandfather, navigates shell holes and floating debris to reach the beach. 12 soldiers wade out to meet her, then 15, 20. The little boat sits dangerously low in the water, but her skipper simply nods and turns toward the horizon. The evacuation develops its own rhythm. Boats arrive. Men wade out through the surf, equipment abandoned, rifles slung across shoulders. The larger vessels take on hundreds at a time from the mole, while smaller craft ferry loads to ships waiting in deeper water. Between the boat runs, there are air raids. Between air raids, artillery barrages from German positions advancing on the perimeter. Between barrages, waiting. The waiting is perhaps the hardest part. Standing in formation while your world collapses. Watching the smoke rise from positions you defended just days ago. Knowing that every hour brings German armor closer to these beaches, closer to cutting off the last escape route. But something extraordinary happens in that waiting. Stories pass through the ranks. Word of the small boats, the civilian volunteers who've crossed the channel to help. Fishermen who've never seen combat, sailing into artillery range to pull soldiers from the surf. Yacht owners navigating by dead reckoning through smoke and shellfire. Even paddle steamers, the kind that carry families on holiday excursions, now loaded with exhausted soldiers heading home. A young British lieutenant, his uniform torn and salt-stained, shares what he's heard from the naval officers. "They're calling it Operation Dynamo," he says. "Started yesterday. They hope to get maybe 30,000 men off the beaches." He gestures toward the endless lines of soldiers. "But look at this. Look at what's actually happening." What's happening defies every military calculation. The small boats make the difference. Vessels too shallow drafted for German submarines, too numerous for the Luftwaffe to target effectively. They ferry men from the beaches to larger ships, creating a shuttle system that multiplies evacuation capacity exponentially. The Royal Navy's destroyers can take 800 men at a time, but they need deep water. The fishing boats and pleasure craft can reach the beach itself, then transfer their human cargo to the destroyers waiting offshore. Henri finally reaches the water's edge as afternoon shadows lengthen across the sand. The boat approaching is a Thames River launch, her peacetime elegance incongruous among the instruments of war. Her captain, a woman in a yellow rain slicker, waves the soldiers forward. "Come on then," she calls. "We haven't got all day." 20 men wade into the surf. The water is shockingly cold, even in May. Henri helps support a wounded sergeant, blood seeping through makeshift bandages. The launch rides low as they climb aboard, but her engine never falters. As they pull away from shore, Henri looks back at the beaches, still crowded with waiting men, still under sporadic artillery fire, still somehow maintaining that impossible discipline. The transfer to the destroyer happens quickly. HMS Wakeful, her crew moving with practiced efficiency despite the chaos surrounding them. Hot tea appears, impossibly, and ship's biscuits that taste better than any meal Henri can remember. The destroyer's captain, a commander who looks barely 30, moves among the evacuated soldiers with quiet confidence. "You'll be in Dover by midnight," he says. "Clean beds, hot food, and all the tea you can drink." As Wakeful turns toward England, Henri watches other ships converging on this same course. Destroyers heavy with human cargo, minesweepers pressed into transport duty, and scattered among them the little boats. Fishing vessels and pleasure craft, paddle steamers and river launches, all heading home across waters that should be impossible to navigate safely. The miracle isn't just in the numbers, though the numbers are staggering. Over 300,000 men will be lifted from these beaches before Operation Dynamo ends. The miracle is in the improvisation, the civilian courage, the way ordinary people responded to extraordinary need. The miracle is in the fishing boat captain who made 7 trips across the channel, in the yacht owner who navigated by compass through smoke and shellfire, in the woman piloting a Thames launch through surf she'd never seen before. The miracle is in the proof that when everything else fails, when armies collapse and governments fall and the machinery of war grinds forward unstoppably, individual human courage can still change the course of history. Echoes of Compiègne. The miracle is in the proof that when everything else fails, when armies collapse and governments fall and the machinery of war grinds forward unstoppably, individual human courage can still change the course of history. But Henri Dubois could not see miracles on June 22, 1940. He could only see the railway car. It sat in the same forest clearing at Compiègne where, 22 years earlier, Marshal Foch had accepted Germany's surrender. The same car, the same clearing, even the same granite memorial stone. Though now German engineers had dynamited away the inscription that spoke of German defeat. History has a cruel sense of symmetry sometimes. Henri stood among the crowd of French officials, still wearing his mud-stained uniform from Dunkirk. 3 weeks had passed since the evacuation, 3 weeks of retreat, of watching his country fold like paper before the German advance. Paris had fallen without a siege. The government had fled to Bordeaux, then collapsed entirely. And now this. The railway car gleamed in the afternoon sunlight. Hitler himself had insisted on this location. This precise choreography of humiliation. Where Germany had once knelt in defeat, France would now sign its surrender. General Keitel read the armistice terms in clipped mechanical German. Henri understood enough to feel each clause like a physical blow. German occupation of the north and west, including all of the Atlantic coast. The French army disbanded, the fleet neutralized, war prisoners to remain in German custody, and France would pay the costs of its own occupation. Marshal Pétain's representatives signed with hands that barely trembled. Henri watched their faces, these men who had commanded armies just months before. Now they scratched their names on documents that carved their nation into pieces. The ceremony lasted barely an hour. Then the Germans towed the railway car away, back to Berlin as a trophy. Henri walked slowly through the forest afterward, his mind struggling to process what he had witnessed. How does a great nation simply stop? How does a country that had endured 4 years of trenches in the last war surrender after 6 weeks in this one? The questions followed him as he made his way back toward Normandy, back toward Sainte-Mère-Église, though he wondered what he would find there. What remained of the world he had known? The village looked almost exactly as he had left it 2 months earlier. The same stone houses, the same narrow streets, the same church spire pointing toward the same sky, but everything had changed. German road signs now marked the intersections, their Gothic script like scars across familiar landscapes. Wehrmacht vehicles moved through streets where children had once played. Officers in field grey uniforms occupied the café where Henri had shared morning coffee with his neighbors. Marie Leclerc found him standing in the village square, staring at a new poster on the wall of the town hall. Marshal Pétain's weathered face gazed down from the placard, above words proclaiming a new French state, a new order, collaboration with Germany for the good of Europe. Henri, Her voice was barely a whisper. "You came back." He turned to her, seeing how the past weeks had aged her. New lines around her eyes, a wariness in her posture that had never been there before. "I came back," he said, "but to what?" She gestured toward the poster. "They say it's for the best. Marshal Pétain, he's a hero of Verdun. If he says we must work with the Germans—" "Work with them?" Henri's voice carried an edge he couldn't suppress. "Marie, I saw what their work looks like. I saw the refugees on the roads, the bombed towns, the—" "Shh." She glanced nervously toward the cafe, where German voices drifted through the open windows. "We have to be careful now. Things are different." Different. Such a small word for such a complete transformation. Over the following days, Henri learned the new rules of existence. Curfews, identity checks, ration cards, the systematic cataloguing of every aspect of daily life under the watchful eyes of the occupation authorities. Some villagers adapted quickly. The mayor spoke enthusiastically about cooperation, about France's place in the new Europe. Certain shopkeepers discovered that German marks spent as well as francs, sometimes better. Others retreated into silence, into the small, careful spaces where they could still think their own thoughts. And a very few, began to whisper about resistance. The whispers started with a voice on the radio, a French general broadcasting from London. Charles de Gaulle, a name Henri had never heard before June 18th, when this unknown colonel had declared that France had lost a battle, not the war. "Whatever happens," the voice crackled through the static, "the flame of French resistance must not and shall not die." Henri listened to these broadcasts in Marie's farmhouse, the radio hidden beneath sacks of grain, the volume turned so low they had to press their ears to the speaker. The BBC French service became a lifeline, proof that somewhere beyond the reach of German authority, the idea of a free France still existed. De Gaulle spoke of honor, of duty, of the moral obligation to continue fighting even when governments surrendered. His words carried across the channel like seeds on the wind, taking root in minds that refused to accept defeat as final. But what did resistance mean for a baker in occupied Normandy? What could one man do against the machinery of conquest that had crushed entire armies? The questions multiplied as summer deepened into autumn. Henri watched German engineers fortifying the coast, building bunkers and gun emplacements along the beaches where he had walked as a child. They spoke of an Atlantic wall, a fortress Europe that would stand for 1,000 years. The permanence of it felt suffocating, as if the occupation was not a temporary condition, but a new reality, the natural order of things. Yet small acts of defiance persisted. Someone painted Vive de Gaulle on the church wall, though it was scrubbed away by morning. Anonymous hands scattered leaflets calling for resistance, though the authors were never found. Radio sets disappeared from shops, not stolen but hidden, waiting. Marie began leaving extra bread at the back of her bakery. She never said why, and Henri never asked. But sometimes the loaves vanished overnight, and sometimes he glimpsed unfamiliar faces in the shadows near her kitchen door. The moral landscape of occupation revealed itself slowly, in choices both large and small, in the decision to look away when neighbors were arrested, in the willingness to inform or to remain silent. In the daily calculation of survival against conscience, Henri found himself caught between worlds. The practical necessity of living under German rule, the emotional pull of de Gaulle's distant voice, the growing certainty that this arrangement, this collaboration, would extract a price from the soul of France that might never be repaid. Winter came early that year. Snow covered the German fortifications along the coast, softening their harsh angles but not their purpose. The occupation settled into routine, the dangerous comfort of accepting the unacceptable as normal. But beneath the snow, beneath the surface of collaboration and compliance, something else was growing. A network of whispers, a community of conscience, the foundation of what would become, in time, a flame that would indeed refuse to die. Oh, the longest shadow. Henri learned to read the new language of occupation in the smallest details. The way Madame Rousseau's shoulders tensed when German boots echoed on cobblestones. How young Pierre's laughter died mid-breath at the sound of approaching motorcycles. The careful neutrality that settled over faces like masks. protective and necessary as winter clothing. The Germans had established their headquarters in the old mayor's office. Clean-shaven officers with pressed uniforms moved through the village with methodical efficiency, requisitioning supplies, posting regulations, transforming the familiar rhythms of daily life into something foreign and watchful. They were not cruel, these particular occupiers, merely thorough, which somehow made their presence more unsettling than outright brutality might have been. Food became a language of its own. The baker's shelves, once abundant with golden loaves and sweet pastries, now held modest portions of dark bread, dense and filling, but lacking the lightness that had once made mornings feel hopeful. Henry watched housewives calculate rations with the precision of mathematicians, weighing not just flour and butter, but the delicate balance between survival and dignity. Marie Leclerc adapted her farming to the new reality with characteristic pragmatism. The Germans required specific quotas of grain and vegetables, leaving her to nurture hidden gardens where she could. Behind the chicken coop, concealed by carefully arranged hay bales, she tended rows of potatoes and turnips. Small rebellions that fed both body and spirit, proof that something remained beyond their control. The curfew transformed evening into something precious and brief. Families gathered earlier around their tables, conversations hushed but somehow more intimate for their urgency. Children learned to play quieter games, stories were told in whispers, as if loud voices might shatter the fragile peace that held their world together. But it was in these whispered conversations that the network began to form. Father Dubois, no relation to Henri despite the shared name, used his Sunday sermons to speak in careful metaphors. Biblical stories of exile and return took on new meanings when spoken to a congregation that understood occupation. His words about faith sustaining the faithful through dark valleys carried messages that German ears might hear as spiritual comfort, while French hearts recognized as something more strategic. The village doctor, old Dr. Moreau, found his medical rounds expanding in unexpected ways. Treating a farmer's injured hand might involve carrying news from one end of the village to another. A visit to check on a sick child could include the quiet transfer of information about German patrol schedules. Observations that seemed innocent but formed part of a larger picture being assembled by unseen hands. Even the children participated, though they rarely understood the full significance of their actions. Young Jacques Petit earned extra bread by running messages between houses, carrying what appeared to be simple notes about borrowed tools or shared meals. His quick feet and innocent face made him nearly invisible to the occupying forces. Just another village boy playing in streets that had become stages for a more complex drama. The postmaster, Monsieur Blanchard, developed an extraordinary memory for letters that never quite reached their intended destinations. Correspondence that might contain useful intelligence had a tendency to be delayed, just long enough for certain villagers to learn what the Germans were planning or requesting. His apologetic explanations about postal difficulties were accepted with the weary resignation that had become the official response to all inconveniences. Winter deepened, and with it came a different kind of cold. Not just the bite of frost on exposed skin, but the chill of constant watchfulness. Trust became a luxury few could afford completely, even among neighbors who had known each other for decades. There remained the careful calculation of how much to reveal, how much to risk, how much to hope. Yet somehow, in the spaces between fear and caution, community persisted. Madame Rousseau discovered that her evening walks past the German checkpoint coincided remarkably well with the times when certain villagers needed to know about unusual activity. Her arthritis, she explained to anyone who asked, required regular movement, and if her constitutional happened to provide useful observations about troop movements or supply deliveries, well, that was simply a fortunate coincidence. The village blacksmith, a massive man named Claude, who had seemed too gentle for his trade even before the war, found new purpose in his work. Repairing German vehicles and equipment gave him access to information about mechanical problems, delays that might affect patrol schedules or supply runs. His broad smile and helpful demeanor made him a favorite among the occupying soldiers, who never suspected that their casual conversations were being carefully remembered and quietly shared. Music became another form of resistance. Madame Beaumont, who had taught piano to village children for 30 years, continued her lessons despite the restrictions. But now the melodies carried additional meaning. Certain songs, played at specific times, served as signals for those who knew how to listen. The opening notes of a Chopin nocturne drifting from her window might indicate that German patrols had passed, or that it was safe for particular activities to commence. Food sharing evolved into something approaching art. A pot of soup delivered to an elderly neighbor might contain more than nourishment, perhaps a small package wrapped in cloth and hidden beneath vegetables. The recipients understood that some gifts required no acknowledgement, no questions, only quiet gratitude and careful discretion. Henri found himself becoming a student of small details, the way certain villagers nodded to each other without speaking, how conversations shifted when particular people joined or left a group, the subtle signals that indicated when someone had news to share or warnings to convey. He began to understand that resistance was not always dramatic gestures or violent confrontation. Sometimes it was simply the refusal to let fear completely extinguish hope. Letters from relatives in other parts of France, when they arrived at all, painted pictures of similar adaptations. Cousins in Lyon wrote carefully about difficult weather conditions, language that Henri learned to interpret as descriptions of German activities or Allied movements. News traveled through these family networks like water finding its way through underground channels, slow but persistent, connecting isolated communities into a larger understanding. The seasons turned, but time itself seemed suspended in a strange space between past and future. The village existed in the present moment, each day requiring its own calculations of safety and survival. Yet beneath this careful navigation of immediate reality, longer thoughts persisted, plans that extended beyond the current crisis, dreams that refused to accept occupation as permanent. As winter gave way to spring, as the snow melted from German fortifications and revealed their stark purpose once again, the network of whispers grew stronger, not through dramatic expansion, but through the quiet deepening of trust, through the gradual recognition that survival required not just individual adaptation, but collective resilience. The flame that de Gaulle had spoken of, the spirit that would not be extinguished, was burning in 1,000 small hearths, fed not by grand gestures, but by the accumulated warmth of ordinary people choosing, again and again, to remain human in circumstances designed to diminish their humanity. Seeds of hope. By the winter of 1942, something had shifted in Sainte-Mère-Église. The change was subtle at first, like the way dawn arrives in the countryside, not with sudden illumination, but with the gradual recognition that darkness has begun to retreat. Henri noticed it in the way Marie now smiled at him when they passed on the street. Not the careful, measured acknowledgement of the early occupation, but something warmer, more genuine, the smile of someone who had found, in the midst of uncertainty, a reason to believe in tomorrow. The resistance network that had begun with whispered conversations and shared glances had evolved into something more sophisticated, more purposeful. Dr. Rousseau's medical visits now carried coded messages between villages. The postmaster's daily rounds included careful observations of German troop movements, information that somehow found its way to London through channels none of them fully understood. But it was Marie's garden that Henri found most remarkable. Despite the rationing, despite the German requisitions that had stripped the countryside of much of its bounty, she had managed to cultivate something extraordinary behind her farmhouse. Not just vegetables for survival, though those grew in neat, efficient rows, but flowers. Flowers that served no practical purpose except to remind anyone who saw them that beauty had not been banished from the world. "They think they can control everything," she told Henri one evening as they walked among the late-blooming chrysanthemums. Her voice carried the quiet confidence of someone who had discovered an unshakable truth. "But they cannot control this. They cannot regulate hope, or legislate beauty, or ration the human spirit." The flowers seemed to glow in the fading light, their colors more vivid against the backdrop of a world that had grown accustomed to the drab uniformity of occupation. Yellow and deep burgundy, pale lavender and rich cream, a palette that spoke of abundance in a time of scarcity. Henri knelt beside a particularly vibrant bloom, its petals still holding the warmth of the day's sun. "How do you do it?" he asked. How do you make them grow like this, when everything else seems to struggle? Marie's hands moved gently among the stems, her touch sure and practiced. The same way we all survive, she said simply, by remembering what we're growing toward, by trusting that spring will come again, even when winter feels endless. The wisdom in her words settled over Henri like a comfortable blanket. Here was someone who understood, perhaps better than any of them, that resistance was not just about opposing what was wrong, it was about nurturing what was right, about maintaining the conditions in which hope could flourish. As autumn deepened into winter, the village found new rhythms of resilience. The evening gatherings in various homes became more regular, more essential, not just for sharing information or coordinating small acts of defiance, but for something more fundamental, for remembering who they were beneath the surface adaptations that survival demanded. Old Francois would tell stories of the previous war, not the battles and strategies that filled the newspapers, but the human moments, the unexpected kindnesses, the way communities had pulled together when everything else fell apart. His weathered voice carried the authority of lived experience, the assurance of someone who had witnessed the full cycle of destruction and renewal. Wars end, he would say, settling back in his chair as the fire crackled in the hearth. Occupations end, but what we choose to preserve in our hearts, what we refuse to let them take from us, that continues. That becomes the foundation for whatever comes next. The children absorbed these lessons differently than the adults, but perhaps more completely. They played games that looked innocent to German patrols, but which actually practiced skills of observation and communication. They learned to move silently through the countryside, to recognize the difference between friendly and hostile footsteps, to carry messages in ways that appeared utterly natural. Young Philippe had become particularly skilled at what his grandmother called invisible errands. He could deliver a loaf of bread that contained more than flour and water, could relay a conversation that had never technically taken place, could be precisely where he was needed without anyone quite remembering how he had gotten there. But it was not just the practical aspects of resistance that the children mastered. They also learned to hold joy carefully, to find moments of genuine laughter even under watchful eyes, to maintain the kind of spontaneous delight that occupation authorities found most difficult to suppress. Henri watched them sometimes, these young guardians of normalcy, and felt something that had been absent from his life for months. Not just hope, though that was certainly present, but a deeper confidence, the recognition that whatever happened in the immediate future, the essential spirit of their community would survive. The German soldiers who patrolled their streets saw order. They saw compliance. They saw a population that had accepted the new reality and adapted accordingly. What they did not see, what they could not see, was the invisible network of connection that had grown stronger rather than weaker under pressure. They did not see the way information flowed through seemingly casual conversations. They did not recognize the significance of Marie's flowers, or the coded meaning in the arrangement of items in shop windows, or the careful choreography of daily routines that had been modified to serve purposes far beyond their apparent function. Most importantly, they did not understand that every small act of preservation, every moment of authentic human connection, every choice to maintain dignity in circumstances designed to erode it, was a form of victory. As 1943 approached, Henri found himself thinking often about seeds, about the way Marie's garden had taught him to see beyond immediate circumstances, about the patient work of cultivation that happened largely out of sight, in darkness, in conditions that seemed hostile to growth. The resistance was like that now. Not the dramatic, visible confrontation that propaganda posters depicted, but something more subtle and perhaps more powerful. The daily choice to remain human. The quiet insistence that beauty and kindness and hope were not luxuries to be abandoned in difficult times, but necessities to be protected at all costs. Standing in his bakery before dawn, his hands working dough that would become bread for his neighbors, Henri could feel it. The change that was coming, not just the military liberation that BBC broadcasts hinted at, but something deeper, the recognition that they had not merely survived the occupation, they had transcended it. They had learned to grow flowers in winter, and spring, when it came, would find them ready. Paris awaits. The seasons turned, as they always had, as they always would. Summer gave way to autumn, autumn to winter, and winter, inevitably, to spring again. Henri watched from his bakery window as the first green shoots pushed through the snow-covered earth of Marie's garden, tiny but determined, carrying within them the promise that no occupation, no matter how complete, could ever truly extinguish. The BBC broadcasts grew more frequent now, more hopeful, names that meant nothing to most villagers but everything to those who understood. Stalingrad, El Alamein, Sicily. The tide was turning somewhere far beyond their small Norman village, but Henri could feel it in the way people walked a little straighter, in the way conversations lingered a moment longer in doorways, in the way children played with renewed laughter in the square where German boots still echoed each morning. Marie had saved seeds through the darkest months, hidden them carefully, tenderly, the way one protects the most precious secrets. Now she moved through her garden with quiet purpose, preparing soil that had known only frost, planning rows that would soon burst with color and life. Her hands, weathered by years of occupation, worked with the same gentle precision Henri remembered from before, when the world was different, when hope was something taken for granted rather than cultivated with such deliberate care. The postmaster still delivered letters, but now there were new kinds of messages hidden in innocent words, coded references to spring planting, to harvest times, to family reunions that might come sooner than expected. The doctor still made his rounds, but his medical bag now carried more than medicine. It carried whispers of liberation, fragments of intelligence, pieces of a larger puzzle that was slowly, surely, coming together. Henri's bread still rose each morning, golden and warm, filling the bakery with aromas that spoke of continuity, of traditions that endured, of simple human needs that no army could legislate away. But now each loaf felt like an act of defiance, each delivery to a neighbor's door a small victory, each shared meal around kitchen tables throughout the village a celebration of something the Germans had tried to destroy but never could. The bonds that made them not just survivors, but a community. The children who had grown up under occupation were different now, older in ways that went beyond years, but not broken. They had learned to find joy in small things, to treasure moments of beauty, to understand that freedom was not something granted by governments, but something carried within, protected, nurtured, passed from one generation to the next like seeds saved through winter. As evening settled over Sainte-Mère-Église, Henri stood in his doorway, watching the last light fade over fields that stretched toward the coast, toward England, toward a world beyond occupation that still existed, still waited, still believed in the possibility of return. Somewhere across that darkening channel, plans were being made, ships were being loaded. Young men were preparing for a journey that would bring them to these very shores, to these very fields, to this very village where ordinary people had learned extraordinary lessons about the resilience of the human spirit and the patient, persistent, unstoppable power of hope that grows quietly in the darkness until the moment comes when it can finally, inevitably, bloom again in the light of a freedom that was never truly lost, only temporarily obscured, like stars behind clouds that eventually, always, part to reveal the eternal patterns that guide us home.